Now, Professor, yesterday we stopped at a point where we were talking about the guidelines and particularly the Canadian and UK dietary guidelines, and we were on page 715. Can we proceed from there, Professor?
So the point of these guidelines is this is the traditional Eat Well Guide, which is the current British guidelines, and they would match very closely the South African guidelines. And the point I want to make is the public health collaboration has questioned certain aspects of these guidelines. The advice that we must avoid fats because they contain saturated fat, they question the dietary reference value that we should not eat more than 35% total fat, and they question the nature, the quality and quantity of the carbohydrates that are being prescribed. So those are the three questions that the public health collaboration are asking about these dietary guidelines, and I think if you go back to the evidence that I presented, those are the sorts of questions that we have been asking as well of the South African dietary guidelines. So this is the conclusion that the public health collaboration comes to in terms of the advice that we should be giving the general public. And they call this the real food lifestyle. And they notice in the third line that they don't recommend counting calories. And what we say is you choose the food and the food will tell you how many calories you need to eat. That's kind of one of the statements we make. So they say instead we recommend that individuals follow these three focuses for healthy living. Number one is eat real foods until you're satisfied, and that is the basis for the book, The Real Meal Revolution. It talks explicitly about eating real foods, which means foods that are not processed. And these foods, as they notice, are naturally nutrient dense. And that is one of the arguments I have with the dietary guidelines. And certainly that's what I've learned from our expert witness, Dr. Zoe Harcom, that nutrient-dense foods are animal-based foods, that the grains and the cereals are not nutrient-dense. And we presented that evidence at my last, when I presented last time, that we're continually told that nutrient-dense foods have to include grains and cereals, and that is simply not true. And I'm sure that we can address that with Dr. Harcom. And so they're minimally altered from their natural state, which will nourish you and satisfy hunger. And that's the key why we say if you eat real foods, which are nutrient dense, your hunger is stilled and you eat less, and that's why you lose weight. In contrast, if you eat fake foods, which are highly processed with lots of sugar in them, you're perpetually hungry, you eat too many calories, and you become obese. And that is the simple hypothesis that we present, and for which I hope we've given you sufficient evidence. Because if that is true, then the obesity epidemic is simple. It's basically processed foods, sugar addiction, continual hunger, overeating. And that's a simple explanation for why we're in the predicament that we are. So avoid fake foods. These are foods that have been highly processed from their natural state with free sugars, highly processed oils, and fortified nutrients which do not nourish you and will not satisfy hunger. And it's really interesting because in her book, Nina Teichhold makes the point that if you actually follow the US dietary guidelines and eat so much cereals and grains, if they were not fortified, you would not get the nutrient balance you need, particularly for certain vitamins and minerals. That's astonishing. So why do we fortify cereals and grains? Because they're so nutrient poor that if you have them as a major proportion of your diet, the diet will not fulfill the criteria for being balanced, which is astonishing. And then they talk about activity, and that's not the issue for us. So those are the British guidelines which have been questioned, and I would argue that everything I've said before you is compatible with those new ideas about how we need to change the dietary guidelines as presented by the public health collaboration. Now, this evidence I think is even more compelling because this is a Senate committee of Canadian senators And this report begins, some people wonder what Canadian senators do when they're not sitting in a giant red room or filing dodgy expense claims. And Mr. Trump is not a Canadian, by the way. So well, some of them just released a bombshellish report calling for a total overhaul of Canada's food system. So these are totally independent senators who have no connections to other outside interests. So it's led by Kenneth Ogilvie, a decorated scientist. The Senate's Social Affairs, Science and Technology Committee spent 2 years studying obesity. And as we indicated yesterday, just as diabetes costs nations a huge amount, they found that obesity costs Canada $4.6 billion to $7.1 billion each year between healthcare and lost productivity. And remember when I showed you the slides about obesity is one of a component of conditions linked to insulin resistance. So if you focus only on obesity, you're missing out heart disease, diabetes, cancer, dementia, as also linked to insulin resistance and high carbohydrates diets. So the report released on Tuesday is a nightmare for food and beverage lobby groups. That's a really interesting statement. It said, why would it be a nightmare for food and beverage lobby groups? The answer is because they feel that the food and beverage lobby groups are involved in the obesity diabetes epidemic in Canada. So some of the recommendations are what you'd expect: increased education, more money, etc. But others call for major changes that Canadian governments have never pursued. And so these are there are 8 points that they make that we need to do, and I'm not going to go through all of them because they're not relevant to this hearing. But I've put in emphasis number 5. The current Canada Food Guide is awful, scrap it. So there's a group of senators who are independent of industry, and they say the Canada Food Guide is awful and needs to be scrapped. And more importantly, they say the food industry should not be involved in setting health guidelines. And I would remind you that the South African Dietary Guidelines were funded by the SA Sugar. They may not have been directly involved, but they're too close. The linkage is far too close. And they're arguing that if we are going to set up health guidelines, the food industry must be excluded and all its involvement. And you have to understand the extent to which the food industry has ingratiated itself and controls everything. There's a paper, there's an article which I haven't presented because it only came out in the last week, showing how Coca-Cola is now involved at a local, national, and international level in trying to reverse the soda tax across the world. And you all hear there, point 2, bring in a soda tax. There are emails, correspondence showing that Coca-Cola has made it a priority to make sure that the soda tax does not come about. And that is where they're spending the money. So to think that the dietary guidelines and the advice that we're going to get on whether or not we should have a soda tax or what we should eat is independent of the food industry is naive. They are deeply involved in directing what we think and how we drew up our guidelines. So then there is the report for which you have the full copy, so one can read this whole report at your convenience. So I have selected out material that is relevant to the information that I presented previously in February. And I want to make the point that I believe everything I presented is precisely as it is in this report, and I want to defend that statement. So, when the Food Guide first recommended a low-fat diet, the food industry responded by producing foods that were lower in fat, with a focus on replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat. Unfortunately, foods also started being higher in carbohydrates, specifically refined carbohydrates, including added sugar. So that's a statement of fact, doesn't need to be checked. The question is, what were the consequences of taking fat out the diet and replacing it with unsaturated fats and with high carbohydrates, and particularly refined carbohydrates and sugar? Several witnesses, and this is not me, this is witnesses in Canada speaking to the Senate committee, explained that the dietary shift to increased consumption of refined carbohydrates and added sugars, primarily from highly processed foods and sugary drinks, has had a profoundly negative effect on the weight and health of Canadians. And I think that most people would agree that, and most dietitians in South Africa would absolutely agree with that statement. So they continue to try to explain now, so if you eat refined carbohydrates and sugars, why should that make you heavier? Why should you get fat by eating refined carbohydrates and sugars? So in terms of weight, witnesses describe the fat-promoting effects of starch and sugar. With respect to sugars, the most abundantly consumed added sugars are sucrose and high fructose corn syrup. And remember, high fructose corn syrup only came into the food chain in about 1980 when it was developed by Japanese and American scientists from grains. And this was one of the products they produced from a product that was going to be thrown out, the residual of grains. They started producing high fructose corn syrup. And the benefit of high fructose corn syrup to industry is that it's cheaper and it's sweeter. And that is why the price of Coca-Cola could come down, because now they could use a sweetener that didn't cost as much. However, some of the fructose is processed in the liver much differently and results in fat synthesis via production of triglycerides. And I showed you that evidence. If the liver becomes overwhelmed with fructose, fat production goes up, and that starts to produce the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is the next epidemic that we are facing. As such, the committee was told that increased consumption of fructose as a component of sucrose, i.e. sugar, and high fructose corn syrup results in overproduction of fat in the liver, leading to increased visceral fat, which is fat in and around the abdominal organs. So this is a mechanism by which fructose specifically leads to obesity, but also causes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which, remember, I showed you is the cause of atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is what causes the heart disease. So this is the direct mechanism why increasing carbohydrate consumption leads to heart disease. And they continue, once sugar and starch have been processed into glucose, the increased concentration in the bloodstream stimulates the secretion of insulin from the pancreas. And I remember showing you a diagram of exactly how that happens. How when you take in even a small amount of carbohydrate, you raise your blood glucose concentration, and that causes insulin to rise. And I spoke at length about the insulin hypothesis of obesity. And they are confirming that they also agree that the insulin theory of obesity holds, and that the argument that obesity is simply calories in, calories out, as I showed you, doesn't explain it. There's a hormonal basis for obesity, and this is the mechanism. So insulin acts on cells throughout the body to take up glucose from the blood to supply their energy. However, insulin also promotes the synthesis of fatty tissues and inhibits the breakdown of body fat as a source of energy. And we made that point that once you eat carbohydrates, you become a carbohydrate burner and you store your fat, and you can't access the fat as long as the insulin is elevated, because insulin is such a powerful inhibitor of fat metabolism. In summary, the insulin that is produced in response to dietary sugar and starch, particularly refined carbohydrates and added sugars that have a high glycemic load, promotes the production of body fat and inhibits the loss of fat. And so, again, by extension, if you're going to promote a high carbohydrate diet, which the South African guidelines are, you must expect that the people are going to get fat. And then they speak about the role of carbohydrates in causing the metabolic syndrome, which we've indicated is such a problem. As described above, the consumption of carbohydrate results in the secretion of insulin, which facilitates the uptake of glucose into cells throughout the body. The consequences of refined carbohydrates and free sugars causes larger surges in insulin to the blood than does the consumption of food in its natural state. And I might add, high-fat foods, of course, don't cause insulin responses, whereas protein do cause a lesser insulin response. So prolonged exposure to insulin results in type 2 diabetes when cells become less sensitive to insulin, known as insulin resistance. And I made that point, that the more carbohydrates you eat, the more insulin resistant you become, and that is a progressive illness which takes time to develop. So that promotes even more insulin secretion in order to get the cells to respond. Eventually, the pancreas's ability to produce insulin may be lost altogether. And then they argue that metabolic syndrome or metabolic disorder caused by insulin resistance precedes the development of type 2 diabetes. And members were told that although life expectancy has been increasing over the past several years, so too have the number of years spent in ill health at the end of life. Several witnesses testified that the primary cause of metabolic syndrome is sugar, as well as refined carbohydrates. And remember, I showed you yesterday the study from Canada showing that once you take the carbohydrates out of the diet, you can reverse metabolic syndrome. And you can't do it any other way than to remove carbohydrates from the diet. So the study I showed you yesterday from Canada confirms the hypothesis that they're making here, that it's carbohydrates that are driving the insulin resistance, and the insulin resistance in the face of a high carbohydrate diet is driving the metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes and obesity. And we showed yesterday in that paper that if you remove the carbohydrates, you can reverse in many people the metabolic syndrome. And then they talk about saturated fat, and some testimony was offered with respect to the dietary advice with regard to fat. For the past 25 years, Health Canada has advised a low-fat diet, have all the authorities around the world. It is also advised that dietary fat may be replaced primarily by the unsaturated fats and oils from vegetables and fish, and that consumption of saturated animal fats found in meats and dairy should be minimized. Members were told that while saturated fats have been part of our diet for thousands of years, vegetable oils are a recent addition in the past few decades. They are in fact start in 1910. And Procter & Gamble are the first people to produce vegetable oils, and they do that because electricity arrives, and Procter & Gamble are making candles, and they say, what technology, how can we use our technology to produce something that will keep us in business? So they said, well, let's produce a product that will replace butter. And so they produced the first vegetable oils in the 1920s. And that then was the beginning of the hypothesis that vegetable oils are healthy because you can replace butter. But there was never any evidence for that. So it was pointed out that saturated fats are chemically stable, and that's critically important. The whole point about saturated fats is they're stable. And they're stable when you cook, and they're stable when you eat, and they're stable in your body. But polyunsaturated fats are unstable. And it's the instability that we believe is causing ill health. And that the massive consumption of vegetable oils in the past 50 years could well be behind many of our chronic diseases. And that the recent reviews of the scientific evidence suggesting that these fats are unhealthy are indicating there has been a misinterpretation of the data. And that is exactly what Nina Teichert and Zoe Harcom will be addressing, the misinterpretation of the data. Further, the committee was told that the unsaturated vegetable oils are unstable when cooked, and they produce carcinogenic products, and we're never told that. And that is evidence coming from the United Kingdom, producing oxidation products whose safety profiles have not been properly assessed. As a result, it was suggested that the effects of reducing dietary saturated fats and increasing unsaturated fats may be introducing a new health consequence that has not been properly explored as yet. And that remains the point, that we don't know what the consequences are of removing saturated fat from the diet and increasing unsaturated fat intake. Several witnesses also pointed out that the effects of dietary advice to reduce overall fat consumption was to increase consumption of carbohydrates, primarily as processed foods, which can produce the metabolic syndrome, as we have shown.